Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the edge of the map meets the edge of reason. Tonight we slip into Alaska, a frozen land where even the daylight feels haunted and the aurora sways like restless spirits. Out here, the roads vanish, cabins rot under snow, and whispers crawl through the pines. These are real stories, drawn from the people who've lived here long enough to know what moves in the dark. Before we start, hit subscribe and tap the bell so the next time the cold calls, you're ready. The night's already settling in, and the first story waits like a shadow at the tree line. Step closer, but not too close. Story 1. Possession of the priest in Dutch Harbor. I watched a dead man speak through the mouth of a priest, and I'd never been able to forget the sound of his voice. Waterlogged and desperate, like someone screaming underwater while their lungs filled with brine. My name is Detective Ray Kowalski, and I spent 22 years working cases across Alaska before what happened in Dutch Harbor made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what might exist in the space between them. It started on October 13th, 2003, when the Coast Guard pulled Tommy Nakamura's body out of Iliulik Bay. Tommy had been a crab fisherman on the Aleutian Dawn, and he'd gone overboard during a storm 3 days earlier. The water temperature was 38 degrees, which meant he had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia killed him. They found him floating face down near the harbor entrance, bloated and blue, his yellow rain slickers spread out around him like the wings of some massive dead bird. I was called to the scene because Tommy's death didn't make sense. The Aleutian Dawn's crew swore he'd been wearing a life jacket when he went over, but his body was found without one. More disturbing, the autopsy would later reveal that Tommy had drowned in fresh water, not salt water, despite being pulled from the middle of the bay. But that is not what I'm here to tell you about. What happened to Tommy was just the beginning. Father Michael Kosolov had been the Catholic priest in Dutch Harbor for 8 years. He was a quiet man in his 50s, originally from a small fishing village on the Kenai Peninsula, and he'd never shown any signs of mental instability. When Tommy's family asked him to perform the last rites over the body, Father Kosolov agreed without hesitation. It was a simple ceremony, something he'd done hundreds of times before. The service was held at St. Herman's Chapel on October 15th. Maybe 20 people showed up, mostly fishermen who worked with Tommy and their wives. I attended as a courtesy, standing in the back while Father Kosolov spoke about eternal rest and divine mercy. Everything seemed normal until the priest began the final blessing. Father Kosolov was standing beside Tommy's casket, hands raised above the body, when his voice changed. Mid-sentence, his careful, measured tone shifted into something else entirely. Something rough and panicked that sounded nothing like the gentle priest I'd known for years. The words that came out of his mouth were Tommy Nakamura's last words, spoken in Tommy's voice, complete with his thick Aleut accent and the speech patterns I remembered from interviewing him months earlier about a bar fight. Father Kosolov began describing his own death. He talked about falling overboard during the storm, about the freezing water closing over his head, about struggling to swim in his heavy gear while 20-foot waves battered him from every direction. But the details he gave didn't match what the Aleutian Dawn's crew had reported. According to the priest speaking in Tommy's voice, he hadn't fallen overboard at all. He'd been pushed. The congregation sat in stunned silence as Father Kosolov continued the narrative, his face blank and expressionless while Tommy's voice poured out of him like water from a burst pipe. He described being held underwater by someone he couldn't see, someone whose hands felt like ice and whose grip was stronger than any living person should possess. Then the voice changed again, becoming older, deeper, tinged with an accent I couldn't place. It spoke about drowning in Iliulik Bay in 1952, about being pulled down by something that lived in the deepest parts of the harbor. The voice after that was different again, describing a death by drowning in 1938. Then another in 1925. I realized with growing horror that Father Kosolov was channeling the voices of every person who had ever drowned in Dutch Harbor's waters. Dozens of them, speaking through him one after another, each describing their final moments with perfect, terrible clarity. The congregation began to panic. People were standing up, heading for the exits, some crossing themselves and muttering prayers. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of this gentle priest being used as a mouthpiece for the dead. That When the voices began to overlap, multiple dead fishermen started speaking through Father Kosolov simultaneously, their words blending together into a chorus of desperation and rage. They spoke about something that lived at the bottom of the bay, something ancient and hungry that had been feeding on drowning victims for over a century. They called it the swimmer. According to the voices pouring through the priest, the swimmer wasn't quite alive and wasn't quite dead. It had been a person once, but it had drowned so long ago that it had forgotten how to stay dead. Now it existed in the dark water at the bottom of the bay, pulling down anyone who fell overboard and adding their voices to its collection. The possessed priest began to move, walking away from the casket with jerky, unnatural steps. His eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only whites, but he navigated the chapel with perfect precision. The overlapping voices grew louder and more agitated, describing their underwater prison and begging for someone to set them free. I followed Father Kosolov as he walked out of the chapel and down to the harbor. Half the congregation trailed behind us, too shocked to do anything but watch. The priest's body moved like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings, his limbs twitching and jerking with each step. When we reached the water's edge, Father Kosolov stopped and pointed at a section of the bay about 50 yards offshore. The voices speaking through him became unified, all speaking the same words in perfect synchronization. They told us exactly where to find the swimmer's lair. The possessed priest described a sunken fishing boat from the 1890s, lying in 40 feet of water near the harbor's deepest channel. Inside the boat, this cabin, they said, we would find the remains of the swimmer and all of its victims. Bones and skulls arranged in careful patterns, like some kind of underwater shrine to drowning. Then Father Kosolov collapsed. When he regained consciousness 10 minutes later, he had no memory of what had happened. The last thing he remembered was beginning the final blessing over Tommy's casket. He was confused and embarrassed by the crowd gathered around him at the harbor, and he kept apologizing for what he assumed was some kind of fainting spell. I should have dismissed the whole incident as a stress-induced breakdown. Mass hysteria combined with the psychological pressure of performing funeral services in a community where death by drowning was an ever-present fear. But I couldn't stop thinking about those voices. They had been too specific, too detailed, too different from each other to be products of Father Kosolov's subconscious mind. And they had all pointed to the same location in the bay. 3 days later, I convinced the Coast Guard to send a dive team to the coordinates the possessed priest had indicated. What they found at the bottom of Glacier Bay confirmed my worst fears. The sunken fishing boat was exactly where the voices said it would be. A wooden vessel from the late 1800s, its hull split open by decades of storms and tides. But inside the cabin, the divers discovered something that made their blood run cold. Human remains, dozens of skeletons arranged in concentric circles around a central figure that had been sitting in the boat's captain's chair for over a century. The central skeleton was different from the others. Its bones had a greenish tint, and they seemed to pulse with their own faint light in the dive team's flashlights. More disturbing, several of the skeletons were recent additions. The divers found Tommy Nakamura's life jacket tied around the bones of what appeared to be a child, and scattered among the older remains were personal effects from fishing boat accidents dating back decades. The Coast Guard tried to recover the remains, but every time a diver approached the central skeleton, their equipment malfunctioned. Regulators failed, masks flooded, and communication systems cut out. 3 different divers reported feeling invisible hands grabbing at them underwater, trying to pull them down into the cabin with the other bones. After the 4th diver nearly drowned during a recovery attempt, the Coast Guard abandoned the operation and classified the site as a maritime hazard. The official report blamed the equipment failures on electromagnetic interference from an unknown source. But I knew the truth. The swimmer was still down there, still collecting victims, still adding their voices to its underwater chorus of the drowned. Father Kosolov never fully recovered from his possession. He continued performing his duties as a priest, but something fundamental had changed about him. He spoke less, smiled rarely, and seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. Parishioners began to complain that his sermons had become obsessed with drowning and death by water. 6 months after the incident, Father Kosolov disappeared. His housekeeper found his room empty except for a note apologizing for what he was about to do. His body was never recovered, but fishermen reported seeing someone walking into Glacier Bay during low tide, wading deeper and deeper until the water closed over his head. The diocese sent a replacement priest, but he lasted less than a year before requesting a transfer. He claimed that he could hear voices whispering from the harbor every night, calling his name, inviting him to join them in the deep water. I left Dutch Harbor in 2005 and moved to Fairbanks, but I never stopped thinking about what I witnessed in that chapel. I've researched every drowning in Iliuliak Bay going back to the 1800s, and the pattern is always the same. Experienced fishermen and swimmers disappearing in calm water, bodies found without their life jackets, witnesses describing victims being pulled underwater by invisible hands. The swimmer is still down there, adding to its collection one soul at a time. And every person who drowns in those waters becomes part of its voice, part of its hunger, part of its eternal need to drag others down into the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Father Kasolov, this voice speaking Tommy, his last words. The fear in those words, the desperation, the terrible realization that something was holding him under the water and wouldn't let him surface. And sometimes, I hear my own name being called from the depths of a harbor 200 miles away. The swimmer remembers everyone who knows its secret, and it is very patient when it comes to collecting what it sowed. Story 2. Kodiak footage. I watched 4 scientists run screaming into the Alaska wilderness on a video that was never supposed to exist. What they were running from made me understand why some research should never be conducted. My name is David Chen, and I work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as a digital evidence specialist. My job involves processing video footage from wildlife cameras, analyzing animal behavior patterns, and creating reports that help determine hunting quotas and conservation policies. Boring work most of the time, but it pays the bills and keeps me outdoors more than a typical office job. The Kodiak footage arrived on my desk 3 weeks ago with a classification stamp I had never seen before. The accompanying paperwork was minimal. A research team from the University of Alaska had been studying brown bear behavior on Kodiak Island during the summer of 1992. The team consisted of 4 biologists who had been granted permits for extended field research in remote areas of the island. On August 15th, the Coast Guard received an emergency beacon signal from the research camp. A rescue helicopter found the site completely abandoned but otherwise undisturbed. Tents were still erected, equipment remained in perfect order, and meals were left half-eaten on folding tables. But the researchers were gone without any sign of struggle or indication of where they might have traveled. The only evidence of what had happened was a single video camera found inside the main research tent. The camera contained 47 minutes of footage recorded during the final night at the camp. For 30 years, that footage remained classified in government archives, deemed too sensitive for public release or academic review. Now they wanted me to analyze it and provide an official assessment of what the video contained. The assignment seemed routine enough, except for one detail that made my hands shake as I loaded the first tape into my player. A handwritten note attached to the file warned that 3 previous analysts had requested transfers to different departments after viewing the complete footage. None of them would discuss what they had seen. The video began normally enough. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead researcher, was providing a summary of their fieldwork to the camera while her colleagues prepared dinner in the background. They had been on Kodiak for 6 weeks, studying the hunting patterns and territorial behavior of the island, this massive brown bears. Their research was going well, with dozens of hours of behavioral footage and comprehensive data on bear populations in previously unstudied areas. But Dr. Martinez mentioned something that caught my attention. They had been finding unusual signs during their final week on the island. Bear tracks that were larger than any recorded in scientific literature, claw marks on trees that reached heights no known bear could achieve, and most disturbing, evidence of predation patterns that didn't match normal brown bear behavior. The footage jumped to later that evening. Dr. James Wong was manning the night shift, monitoring audio equipment designed to record bear vocalizations in the surrounding forest. The timestamp showed 11:37 p.m., and Wong appeared calm as he adjusted recording levels and made notes in a field journal. That is when the sound started. At first, it was just normal forest noise. Wind through the trees, the distant call of a loon, the rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth. But gradually, something else began to emerge from the background audio. A low rumbling that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, like a massive engine idling just beyond the range of human vision. Wong noticed it too. He stopped writing and tilted his head, listening intently to something the camera microphone was barely picking up. His expression changed from curiosity to concern as the rumbling grew louder and more defined. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic, Something huge was moving through the forest around their camp, circling them with deliberate patience. The video quality degraded as Wong grabbed the camera and moved toward the tent entrance. The automatic lighting system struggled to compensate for the darkness outside, creating a strobing effect that made it difficult to follow his movements. But the audio remained clear, and what I heard through my headphones made my skin crawl. The rumbling had changed pitch, becoming more rhythmic, like breathing, but from lungs the size of oil drums. And underneath that sound, something that might have been footsteps. Heavy impacts on forest floor, spaced too far apart to belong to any normal animal. Wong whispered something to his colleagues inside their sleeping tent, and within seconds, all 4 researchers were awake and moving with the kind of urgent coordination that comes from real fear. Dr. Martinez took control of the camera while the others grabbed essential equipment and emergency supplies. Nobody spoke above a whisper, but their movements screamed panic. The timestamp showed 11:51 p.m. when they made the decision to evacuate the camp. Dr. Martinez aimed the camera toward the forest perimeter as they prepared to leave. The night vision setting revealed shapes moving between the trees, but the resolution was too poor to make out details. What was clear was the size of whatever was out there. Shadows that stood twice as tall as a normal bear, moving with intelligence and purpose that no wild animal should possess. The evacuation was chaos. 4 adults stumbling through darkness, carrying scientific equipment and survival gear while something massive tracked their movements from the tree line. The camera work became erratic as Dr. Martinez struggled to document their escape while navigating treacherous terrain in complete darkness. But the audio told the real story. The breathing sounds were getting closer, accompanied now by other noises that defied classification. Scraping sounds like claws on stone. Wet, organic noises that suggested something feeding or preparing to feed. And occasionally, something that might have been communication between multiple entities. They were being hunted by more than one creature. The researchers moved inland, away from their coastal camp and toward higher ground where they hoped to find better visibility and possibly signal for rescue. But their pursuers adapted to every change in direction, herding them like sheep toward some predetermined destination. Dr. Wong appeared on camera briefly when they stopped to rest near a stream. His face was pale with exhaustion and terror, and he kept glancing over his shoulder at sounds only he could hear. He whispered something to Dr. Martinez about the size of the tracks they were leaving behind. Tracks that suggested bipedal movement but with feet far larger than any human or known primate. The footage became increasingly surreal as the night progressed. The researchers found themselves moving through landscape that didn't match their topographical maps. Valleys that should have been meadows were filled with dense forest. Hills that should have been gradual slopes became steep cliffs that forced them to backtrack repeatedly. It was as if the island itself was changing around them, reshaping its geography to prevent their escape. By 3 a.m., they were completely lost. The GPS equipment was malfunctioning, showing coordinates that placed them hundreds of miles from their known location. Radio communication with the outside world had been impossible since leaving camp, despite using equipment that had worked perfectly for weeks. Dr. Martinez focused the camera on Dr. Lisa Park, their wildlife behavior specialist, as she examined something she had found near their latest rest stop. Large depressions in the soft earth, spaced in a pattern that suggested footprints but unlike anything in the scientific literature. Each print was nearly 3 feet long and showed evidence of claws that extended well beyond the toe impressions. But what made Dr. Park, his hands shake as she took measurements, was the depth of the impressions. Whatever had made these tracks weighed at least twice as much as the largest brown bear on record. And the spacing between prints suggested a stride length that would require legs over 8 feet in total length. The researchers were being stalked by something that shouldn't to exist. The final 20 minutes of footage documented their discovery of a cave system in the island, its interior highlands. The caves offered potential shelter and multiple exit routes if they needed to escape quickly. But as they explored deeper into the underground passages, the camera captured details that transformed my understanding of what they were dealing with. The cave walls were covered with claw marks, but arranged in patterns too organized to be random scratching. Some of the marks formed shapes that looked almost like primitive writing or territorial markers. And scattered throughout the passages were bones. Lots of bones, from animals that had been systematically butchered and consumed. Most of the remains belonged to deer, salmon, and other normal Kodiak wildlife. But some of the larger bones were clearly from brown bears, animals that should have been apex predators with no natural enemies on the island. Whatever lived in these caves was hunting the hunters. Dr. Martinez discovered the worst evidence deeper in the cave system. a collection of human artifacts arranged in what could only be described as a shrine or feeding display. Backpacks, hiking boots, and camping equipment from previous visitors to the island, all showing signs of violence and predation. The items dated back decades, suggesting that whatever inhabited these caves had been claiming human victims for much longer than anyone suspected. And the arrangement of the artifacts showed intelligence and planning that went far beyond normal animal behavior. The footage ended abruptly at 4:37 a.m. Dr. Martinez was documenting the artifact display when something happened behind the camera. A sound like thunder mixed with the roar of a freight train filled the audio track, and the camera spun wildly as Dr. Martinez dropped it and ran toward the cave entrance. The final frames showed glimpses of her colleagues running ahead of her through the underground passages. Behind them, something massive was moving through the caves with speed that defied its apparent size. The camera captured brief images of fur and claws and eyes that reflected light like polished glass before the recording stopped completely. No trace of the research team was ever found, despite extensive search efforts by the Coast Guard and Alaska State Troopers. The cave system Dr. Martinez had documented couldn't be located, even with GPS coordinates extracted from the video footage. It was as if the entire landscape had been erased from existence. But 3 months later, hikers found Dr. Wang's field journal in a completely different area of the island, nearly 40 miles from where the research camp had been established. The journal contained detailed notes about their final weeks on Kodiak, including observations about bear behavior that didn't match any known species. The last entry, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, described creatures that stood upright like humans but possessed the strength and ferocity of giant bears. Creatures that displayed pack hunting behavior and territorial intelligence far beyond normal wildlife. Creatures that had been living in the remote areas of Kodiak Island for generations, avoiding human contact until the research team ventured too deep into their domain. I submitted my analysis report last Friday, officially classifying the footage as inconclusive evidence of unknown wildlife behavior. But I also requested a transfer to a different department, joining the 3 previous analysts who had refused to discuss what they had witnessed. Because some truths are too dangerous to document officially. Some discoveries should remain buried in classified archives where they can, to inspire others to go looking for evidence that no one should ever find. But late at night, when I am lying in bed trying to forget what I saw on that video, I sometimes wonder about other research teams working in remote areas of Alaska. Teams studying wildlife behavior in places where humans rarely venture, armed with cameras and scientific curiosity but no understanding of what might be watching them from the shadows between the trees. The footage from Kodiak Island proved that we don't know everything that lives in the wild places of our world. And maybe that is for the best. Some knowledge comes with a price that is too high for anyone to pay. Story 3 to 1998 Nome blood snow. The snow that fell on Nome that February morning wasn't white. It came down in flakes the color of rust, drifting like dried blood across a town that had no idea it was about to become ground zero for something that meteorologists couldn't explain and the government wouldn't acknowledge. I was working as a bush pilot out of Nome in 1998, flying supplies to remote villages scattered across western Alaska. February is brutal in that part of the state. Temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, winds that turn snow into horizontal knives, and darkness that swallows the world for most of each day. But I had seen every kind of weather the Arctic could throw at me. Nothing had prepared me for blood snow. It started falling around 6 in the morning on February 18th. I was pre-flighting my Cessna 180 at the Nome airport when the first flakes hit my windshield. At first, I thought it was just dust or debris caught in normal snow. But as the fall intensified, the red tint became unmistakable. The entire sky was dropping what looked like frozen blood across the Seward Peninsula. The Weather Service called it a freak atmospheric event caused by algae particles picked up from the Bering Sea. Red algae blooms were common in warmer climates, they said, and unusual wind patterns had somehow carried microscopic organisms hundreds of miles inland where they froze and fell with the precipitation. The explanation sounded reasonable until people started having the dreams. Maria Santos was the first to report it. She ran the Front Street Diner and lived in an apartment above the restaurant. The morning after the blood snow, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hands shaking as she poured coffee, jumping at every sound. When I asked what was wrong, she described dreams so vivid they felt more real than her waking hours. In the dreams, Maria walked through Nome, streets in the middle of the night, but the town was different. Buildings were arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Streetlights cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. And beneath the snow, something vast was stirring, pushing up from the permafrost like a buried city trying to surface. Other residents began reporting similar experiences. Dreams of walking through a twisted version of Nome where familiar landmarks existed in impossible configurations. Dreams of meeting neighbors who spoke in languages that predated human speech. Dreams of digging through snow and permafrost to uncover structures that belonged to no known civilization. But the most disturbing aspect was the sleepwalking. Every morning after the blood snow, residents found evidence that they had been active during the night. Footprints leading from their homes to locations around town they had no memory of visiting. Photographs they didn't remember taking. Items moved or rearranged in ways that suggested purposeful activity. Tom Mitchell, a local carpenter, woke up one morning to find his toolshed reorganized according to a pattern he had never seen before. His hammers, saws, and measuring tools were arranged in geometric formations that seemed to pulse with significance he couldn't grasp. Security cameras around town captured residents wandering the streets at all hours, moving with the mechanical precision of people following instructions they couldn't consciously hear. I should have left Nome right then. Should have filed a flight plan for Anchorage and never looked back. But bush pilots develop a stubborn streak. We fly in conditions that would ground airline pilots, and we don't to run from weather just because it looks unusual. That was before I started having the dreams myself. The first one came 3 nights after the blood snow. I found myself standing in my hangar at the airport, but the building had changed. The walls were covered in symbols that looked like a combination of Inupiaq writing and something far older. My Cessna sat in the center of the space, but its familiar blue and white paint scheme had been replaced by markings that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. In the dream, I understood that my plane was being prepared for a specific flight. Coordinates appeared in my mind. Longitude and latitude that corresponded to a location deep in the Brooks Range, hundreds of miles north of Nome. I was supposed to fly there, carrying passengers who were already waiting at the airport. I woke up in my hangar, standing exactly where the dream had placed me. My plane sat before me, and someone had indeed changed its markings. Complex symbols covered the fuselage in what looked like fresh paint, but when I touched them, my fingers came away clean. The markings weren't painted on. They were somehow part of the metal itself. That was when I discovered I wasn't the only one being prepared for something. Around town, other residents were experiencing similar modifications to their possessions and environments. Vehicles developed navigation systems that showed destinations not found on any map. Radios picked up signals broadcasting coordinates in the same ancient language that appeared in everyone's dreams. And photographs taken during the sleepwalking episodes showed groups of Nome residents gathering at specific locations around town, always at the same times, always following the same ritual patterns. The official investigation lasted exactly 3 days. Federal agents arrived from Anchorage, collected samples of the red snow, interviewed a handful of residents, and left with the conclusion that the entire incident was caused by atmospheric algae and mass hysteria. Case closed. But the dreams intensified after the agents departed. I began to understand what was happening to Nome through information that downloaded into my brain during sleep. The blood snow wasn't algae. It was a form of organic transmission medium, carrying microscopic entities that had been waiting beneath the Arctic ice for thousands of years. These entities didn't possess humans in any traditional sense. Instead, they established a symbiotic relationship, using human consciousness to navigate the physical world while providing their hosts with knowledge about Earth's true history. According to the dreams, humanity wasn't the first intelligent species to evolve on the planet. An earlier civilization had achieved technological advancement far beyond current human capabilities before disappearing during the last ice age. That civilization had built cities beneath the polar ice caps, using geothermal energy to maintain habitable environments while the surface world was locked in glaciation. The entities in the blood snow were descendants of that earlier civilization, adapted over millennia to survive in the spaces between ice crystals. As global warming began melting polar ice, they were being released back into the atmosphere, seeking suitable hosts to help them reclaim a world that had once been theirs. Nome was chosen as a test site because of its isolation and its position on the edge of the Bering Sea. If the symbiotic relationship proved successful, similar events would occur in Arctic communities around the globe. Humanity wouldn't to be destroyed. It would be upgraded, given access to technologies and knowledge that could solve every environmental and energy problem facing the planet. But the upgrade came with a price. The dreams showed me what Nome would become once the transformation was complete. The town would serve as a hub for activities that extended far beneath the surface, connected to the ancient cities through tunnels that were already being excavated by residents during their nighttime wanderings. The airport would become a transport center for missions that reached into dimensions of space that conventional physics couldn't describe. And I would be the chief pilot for an airline that served destinations no human had ever imagined. The final dream came 2 weeks after the blood snow. I found myself in the cockpit of my Cessna, but the instrument panel displayed readings that corresponded to no earthly navigation system. Altitude readings showed negative numbers, indicating flight paths that descended below sea level into spaces that existed parallel to normal reality. Compass headings pointed toward directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. My passengers were Nome residents I recognized, but they had been changed by their symbiotic relationships with the entities from the snow. Their eyes reflected light like polished metal, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in frequencies that conveyed meaning beyond human language. They were eager to begin the journey to places their new partners remembered from before the Ice Age. I woke up in my plane at 30,000 feet, flying over terrain that appeared on no chart. Below me, the landscape looked like aerial photographs of Mars, red sand formations and geometric structures that suggested intelligence but not human origin. My fuel gauge read full despite the fact that I had been flying for hours, and my passengers sat in perfect silence, their transformed eyes reflecting the alien landscape below. That was when I realized the symbiosis was complete. The entities from the blood snow hadn't just shared their knowledge. They had merged with human consciousness to create something entirely new. The dreams weren't dreams at all, but memories of our new hybrid existence. Nome had become the first successful test of a process that would eventually transform human civilization into something capable of surviving in a universe far stranger than we had ever imagined. I flew that plane for 3 months, carrying passengers between Nome and destinations that existed in the spaces between conventional reality. Each flight took us further from the world I had known, deeper into territories that the ancient civilization had mapped long before humans developed agriculture. But gradually, I began to understand that the transformation wasn't permanent. The entities from the blood snow were dying. Their civilization had survived the Ice Age, but it couldn't survive the modern world. Pollution, electromagnetic radiation, and atmospheric changes caused by human industrial activity were toxic to their hybrid nature. The symbiotic relationship was a desperate gamble, an attempt to preserve their knowledge and consciousness before their species went extinct. Nome was their final gift to humanity, a demonstration of what we could become if we were willing to abandon our purely human limitations. But the gift came with an expiration date. By summer, the effects of the blood snow began to fade. Residents stopped sleepwalking, stopped having the coordinated dreams, stopped modifying their possessions according to patterns they couldn't consciously understand. The symbols on my plane faded like photographs left in sunlight, and the impossible destinations disappeared from my navigation systems. The federal agents returned in August to conduct follow-up interviews. They found a town full of people who remembered having unusually vivid dreams after exposure to red snow, but nothing more significant than that. The official report attributed the entire incident to mass hysteria caused by an unusual but harmless atmospheric phenomenon. Most of Nome's residents seemed relieved to return to normal life. But I kept flying. The ancient civilization's maps were still accurate, even if I could no longer access their non-dimensional destinations. Hidden beneath Alaska, its wilderness were physical remnants of their cities, ruins that conventional archaeology would never find because they existed partially outside normal space-time. I've spent the past 20 years documenting these sites, photographing structures that shouldn't exist and collecting artifacts that demonstrate technology beyond current human understanding. The entities from the blood snow are gone, but their legacy remains buried in the ice, waiting for another generation of humans brave enough to accept their gift of transformation. Nome still gets unusual snowfall every few years. Nothing as dramatic as the blood snow, but residents report dreams that feel more real than their waking hours. Dreams of flying to impossible destinations, of walking through cities built according to geometries that human minds can barely process. The symbiosis is still there, dormant but not dead. And sometimes, Late at night when the aurora lights up the Arctic sky, I can still hear the entities calling from their dying cities beneath the ice. They re-offering the same deal they made in 1998. Knowledge beyond human understanding, technology that could save our species from environmental collapse, access to regions of space that extend far beyond the 3 dimensions we normally perceive. All we have to do is be willing to stop being purely human. The blood snow was just the beginning. The real question is whether humanity is ready for what comes next. Story 4. Seward, this folly shipwreck specters. The dead sailor pointed toward shore with such desperate urgency that I almost forgot he had been underwater for over 100 years. His mouth was open in what could have been a scream or a warning, and his ghostly finger aimed directly at the lights of Seward like he was trying to tell me something I needed to know before it was too late. I was 40 feet down in Resurrection Bay, exploring a Civil War-era merchant ship that local fishermen had been whispering about for decades. The wreck sat on a ledge about 2 miles offshore from Seward, perfectly preserved in Alaska, as frigid waters. According to maritime records, the vessel was called the Northern Promise, sunk during a storm in 1867, the same year the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. My name is Jack Morrison, and I run a small dive charter business out of Seward. 20 years of commercial diving had taken me to wrecks all over the North Pacific, but I had never encountered anything like what I found aboard the Northern Promise. The ship was intact, listing only slightly to starboard on the rocky shelf. Her cargo hold still contained wooden crates marked with symbols I didn't recognize, and the crew quarters were filled with personal effects that looked like they had been abandoned yesterday. But it was the bodies that stopped me cold. They were still at their posts. The captain stood at the wheel, his skeletal hands gripping the spokes. Sailors hung frozen in the rigging, their clothes preserved by the near-freezing water. And in the engine room, men were positioned around machinery that didn't match any Civil War-era technology I had ever seen. But these weren't just skeletons. As I moved through the ship with my underwater camera, the crew began to move. The first one I noticed was a young sailor near the bow. As my dive light swept across his position, he turned his head to follow the beam. Water had long since claimed his eyes, but the empty sockets seemed to track my movement with unmistakable intelligence. When I approached for a closer look, he raised one arm and pointed toward the surface, toward the lights of Seward visible through 60 feet of dark water. Other crew members began exhibiting the same behavior. No matter where I positioned myself on the wreck, they would turn to face me and point toward shore. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to communicate something crucial but lacked the ability to speak. I should have surfaced immediately. Should have called the Coast Guard and reported a maritime anomaly that exceeded my experience as a commercial diver. But the mystery was too compelling, and I had never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of death and decay like this. The ship's log was still readable, protected in the captain's quarters by a waterproof chest. The leather-bound book contained entries that told a story very different from the official maritime records. According to Captain Samuel Harrison's handwriting, the Northern Promise wasn't a merchant vessel. It was a military transport carrying a classified cargo from Russian Alaska to American authorities in Seattle. The cargo consisted of artifacts and documents related to what the Russians called the Seward Purchase, but the real transaction involved more than just land and money. The final log entries described strange phenomena during the voyage south. Crew members reported hearing voices in languages that predated human speech. The ship's compass spun wildly, pointing toward magnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist in the Gulf of Alaska. And most disturbing, the cargo in the hold began exhibiting properties that defied conventional physics. Captain Harrison wrote about crates that became lighter or heavier without any change in contents. Documents that rewrote themselves overnight, replacing Russian text with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And artifacts that seemed to influence the behavior of anyone who spent time near them, causing crew members to speak in coordinated patterns as if they were being controlled by a single intelligence. The ship's final entry was dated March 15, 1867. The cargo has awakened something beneath these waters. We are no longer sailing over the ocean floor. Something vast is rising from the deep, following our course toward the American mainland. God help us all, we may have delivered more than territory to the United States. That was when I realized the crew wasn't pointing toward Seward randomly. They were trying to warn me about what their cargo had awakened on the seafloor. As I read the captain's log, my depth gauge began registering impossible readings. According to my instruments, I was descending even though I hadn't He moved from the ship's quarterdeck. The water around me was growing darker, colder, and filled with sounds that had no business existing 40 feet underwater. I looked down through the murky depths and saw lights moving far below the northern promise. Not the random phosphorescence of deep-sea creatures, but organized patterns of illumination that suggested intelligence and purpose. Something was rising from the ocean floor, drawn by my presence on the wreck. The ghostly crew became more agitated as the lights approached. Their pointing grew frantic, and I could see their mouths moving in coordinated patterns, as if they were trying to shout warnings I couldn't hear through the water. They had been trying to prevent anyone from disturbing their cargo for over a century, but their warnings had been mistaken for mere haunting behavior. The lights below resolved into structures that challenged everything first knew about marine geology. Massive geometric formations rose from the seafloor like an underwater city built according to architectural principles that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. The buildings, if they were buildings, existed in dimensions that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating optical illusions that made my head pound even through my diving mask. And emerging from those structures were inhabitants. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures born to deep water, but their forms suggested intelligence far beyond anything in Earth's evolutionary record. Some resembled jellyfish the size of houses, their translucent bodies pulsing with internal light. Others looked like massive sea anemones, but their movements were coordinated and purposeful rather than reactive. But the most disturbing were the ones that looked almost human. They swam with the efficiency of dolphins, but their faces showed intelligence that was unmistakably sapient. Their skin had adapted to deep water pressure, becoming translucent and phosphorescent. And when they looked up at me through the dark water, their eyes held knowledge that spanned geological ages. These weren't sea creatures. They were the original inhabitants of Alaska, the intelligence that had inhabited the region long before Russians or Americans ever laid claim to the territory. The Seward Purchase hadn't just transferred land from one government to another. It had disturbed a civilization that had existed in the deep waters of the Gulf of Alaska for thousands of years. The Northern Promise had been carrying evidence of this civilization back to American authorities. Artifacts, documents, and specimens that proved the territory contained more than just natural resources. But the cargo had served as a beacon, alerting the deep dwellers to the presence of surface humans who now knew about their existence. The ship had been sunk not by a storm, but by inhabitants of the underwater city who couldn't allow knowledge of their existence to reach the outside world. The crew had been preserved as guardians, doomed to warn away future explorers who might discover what lay beneath Resurrection Bay. But I had gone too far, stayed too long. The deep dwellers were rising, and they had decided that the time for secrecy was over. My regulator began malfunctioning as pressure changes affected my equipment. The water around me was warming despite the depth, heated by energy sources that existed far below the ocean floor. And through my diving mask, I could see more lights approaching from every direction, not just from the city below, but from similar structures scattered across the seafloor. The Northern Promise hadn't been the only ship to encounter the deep dwellers. All along the Alaskan coast, vessels carrying sensitive cargo had been intercepted and sunk. Their crews preserved as eternal guardians. Their holds converted into monitoring stations where the underwater civilization could observe surface activities. The ghostly sailors around me pointed more frantically toward shore, and now I understood their message. They weren't just warning me to leave. They were telling me that the deep dwellers were planning to surface. After 150 years of secrecy, Alaska's original inhabitants were ready to reclaim their territory. Seward, its lights twinkled innocently on the surface, unaware that an intelligence older than human civilization was rising from the depths to announce its presence to the modern world. I tried to ascend, but my buoyancy control was failing. The water around me had become dense, almost viscous, as if the ocean itself was trying to prevent my escape. The deep dwellers were surrounding the wreck, their phosphorescent bodies creating a constellation of alien intelligence in the dark water. That was when I heard them speaking, not in air or water, but directly into my consciousness. Their voices harmonized in frequencies that bypassed human language, conveying meaning through emotional resonance rather than words. They explained that Alaska had never belonged to Russia or America. It had always been theirs, a territory that extended far beneath the surface into realms that surface dwellers couldn't imagine. The purchase of 1867 had been a transaction between thieves, two nations selling and buying land that wasn't he dares to trade. But the deep dwellers had been patient, watching and waiting for the right moment to correct this historical error. That moment had arrived. Climate change was affecting their deep water habitats, forcing them to consider relocating closer to the surface. Ocean acidification was damaging their cities, and warming temperatures were disrupting the thermal layers that had hidden them for centuries. They could no longer remain invisible while surface humans destroyed the marine environment they depended on for survival. The Northern Promise and her crew had been maintained as an embassy, a meeting point where first contact could occur under controlled circumstances. But decades had passed without any surface dwellers proving worthy of communication. Until now, the deep dwellers offered me a choice. I could return to the surface and serve as their ambassador, preparing humanity for the revelation that Earth's oceans contained an ancient civilization with legitimate claims to vast underwater territories. Or I could join the crew of the Northern Promise, serving as another guardian until someone more suitable discovered the wreck. But there was a third option they didn't mention directly. As I hung suspended 40 feet underwater, surrounded by beings whose existence would revolutionize human understanding of Earth's history, I realized that some knowledge comes with a price too high to pay. The deep dwellers weren't offering peaceful coexistence. They were announcing the beginning of a territorial dispute that would make every previous war look like a neighborhood disagreement. I made my choice. My dive knife cut through my air hose with a single swift motion. The ocean rushed into my lungs, cold and final, as I joined the crew of the Northern Promise in their eternal watch over secrets that the surface world wasn't ready to learn. But the deep dwellers kept their word about first contact. Every few years, commercial divers and marine researchers report encounters with the Northern Promise. They describe ghostly sailors who point frantically toward shore, trying to deliver warnings about something approaching from the depths. Most dismiss these accounts as decompression sickness or equipment malfunction. A few understand the message and spread word quietly through diving communities along the Pacific coast. We're still down here, still trying to warn anyone who will listen that Alaska's purchase price was far higher than $7.2 million. The deep dwellers are rising. The lights of their cities are spreading across the ocean floor from the Aleutians to the Pacific Northwest. And when they finally surface, humanity will discover that they've been living on borrowed land for over a century. Seward's folly wasn't buying Alaska from Russia. It was stealing it from the rightful owners, who never forgot and never forgave. The ghostly crew of the Northern Promise points toward shore because that is where the reckoning will begin. Still brave enough to keep going? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. It keeps the fire burning while we're deep in Alaska's dark. Drop a comment about where you're listening from. Sometimes the whispers follow. Story 5. Station 5. I never believed in ghosts until I spent 43 days alone at Alaska Pipeline Pump Station 5 during the polar night. The dead workers there don't want to be forgotten, and they drive you insane to make sure you remember their names. My assignment started in November, when the regular maintenance crew at Station 5 reported equipment malfunctions that couldn't be diagnosed remotely. As a senior pipeline technician with 15 years of experience, I was sent north to conduct a full systems analysis and implement whatever repairs were necessary to keep the oil flowing south to Valdez. Station 5 sits 300 miles north of Fairbanks, connected to civilization by a single gravel road that becomes impassable during winter storms. The facility is completely automated under normal conditions, monitored by computers in Anchorage and serviced by rotating crews who fly in for scheduled maintenance. But when the automated systems start failing, someone has to stay on site until the problems are resolved. The helicopter dropped me off on a gray November morning when the sun barely cleared the horizon. The pilot warned me that weather conditions might prevent pickup flights for several weeks, but I had dealt with Arctic isolation before. I packed enough supplies for 2 months and settled in for what I assumed would be routine troubleshooting work. The station itself was a collection of utilitarian buildings surrounded by massive pumping equipment and storage tanks. Everything was painted in bright colors to make it visible during whiteout conditions, but the cheerful paint couldn't hide the industrial brutality of the place. This was machinery designed to move millions of barrels of oil across 800 miles of wilderness, and human comfort was never part of the design equation. My first week passed without incident. The reported equipment failures were intermittent and difficult to reproduce, suggesting problems with sensors or control circuits rather than major mechanical issues. I established a routine of daily inspections, system diagnostics, and maintenance tasks that kept me busy from dawn to dusk. But as the days grew shorter and the polar night approached, I began to notice things that weren't in any technical manual. Tools would disappear from where I had left them, only to reappear in different locations hours later. Wrenches would be found in electrical panels, screwdrivers in places they couldn't possibly have fallen, entire toolboxes relocated to different buildings overnight. At first, I blamed my own distraction or fatigue, but the pattern became too consistent to ignore. The security system started malfunctioning during my second week. Motion detectors would trigger in empty buildings, setting off alarms that woke me from exhausted sleep in the middle of the night. The surveillance cameras showed nothing but empty corridors and equipment rooms, but the sensors insisted that something large was moving through the facility. I contacted headquarters in Anchorage and reported the security issues, but the remote diagnostics showed all systems functioning normally. From their perspective, the sensors were working perfectly and responding to legitimate motion events. The problem was that I was the only living thing for 50 miles in any direction. The temperature dropped to 40 below during my third week, and the sun disappeared completely. The polar night had begun, plunging Station 5 into a darkness that would last until late January. Emergency lighting provided basic illumination, but beyond the glow of the facility, the world became an absolute void that seemed to swallow sound and movement. That was when I started seeing the figures, shadows moving just outside my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. At first, I assumed it was eye strain from working in artificial light, but the shadows became more distinct as the nights progressed. Human shapes walking through the facility, carrying tools and equipment like they were reporting for a work shift. The figures never interacted with me directly, but their presence was unmistakable. I would enter a building to find equipment running that I hadn't deactivated, gauges reading pressures and temperatures for systems that were offline. Work orders would appear on computer terminals, requesting maintenance on components that hadn't been installed at Station 5 in 20 years. I tried to research the history of the facility, hoping to find explanations for what I was experiencing. What I discovered in the company archives made my hands shake as I read through decades of incident reports and personnel records. Station 5 had a casualty rate that was 3 times higher than any other facility on the pipeline. Industrial accidents, equipment failures, and what the reports euphemistically called exposure incidents had claimed the lives of 47 workers since the station became operational in the 1970s. Most of the deaths occurred during winter months, when crews were isolated by weather and dependent on equipment that could fail without warning. The worst incident happened in 1984, when a crew of 6 technicians died during a blizzard that trapped them at the station for 3 weeks. The official cause was carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning heating system, but witness statements from the rescue team suggested something more disturbing. The bodies were found in positions that indicated they had been working on repairs right up until the moment they died, despite being unconscious from gas exposure for hours before their hearts stopped. The rescue team reported finding maintenance work completed throughout the facility, repairs that would have taken days to accomplish but somehow finished during the final night when all 6 crew members should have been dead or dying. Tools were found arranged in perfect order, work logs were updated with precise technical notes, and systems that had been offline for weeks were running smoothly. It was as if the dead workers had continued their duties even after their bodies stopped functioning. Reading those reports during my 4th week alone at Station 5, I began to understand what I was dealing with. The shadows I was seeing weren't the hallucinations caused by isolation and darkness. They were the ghosts of men who had died believing their work was more important than their lives, and death hadn't to change their priorities. But understanding didn't make the experience less terrifying. The phantom workers became more active as the polar night deepened, and their presence grew from peripheral glimpses to direct encounters that challenged my sanity. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find my toolbox had been organized by someone else, with implements arranged according to a system I didn't recognize. Work orders would appear on my desk, written in handwriting that varied from note to note like multiple people were leaving me instructions. And the facility, its automated systems would complete maintenance routines that I hadn't programmed, performing complex diagnostics that required human intervention. The emergency alarms became a nightly occurrence. Fire suppression systems would activate in empty buildings, flooding equipment rooms with foam that I would have to clean up the next morning. Pressure relief valves would trip without cause, venting thousands of dollars worth of oil into containment systems that operated perfectly despite having no reason to function. But most disturbing were the maintenance logs. Every morning, I would find entries describing work that had been completed during the night shift. Detailed technical notes about repairs, inspections, and system adjustments, all signed with employee numbers that belonged to workers who had died years or decades earlier. The Phantom crew was keeping Station 5 operational, maintaining equipment and preventing failures that could have killed me just as they had killed the living workers who came before me. But their help came with a price that became clear during my 5th week alone in the Arctic darkness. I started finding personal items that didn't belong to me. Photographs of families I had never met, letters addressed to men whose names appeared on the memorial plaque in the main facility, work boots that were too small for my feet, safety helmets with employee numbers from the 1980s, and personal tools engraved with initials that belonged to the dead. The ghosts wanted me to know who they were. They wanted their names and stories remembered, their sacrifice acknowledged by the living. And they were prepared to drive me insane to make sure their message was delivered. The breaking point came during my 6th week, when the Phantom workers started leaving me direct communications. Handwritten notes appeared on my desk every morning, describing their lives and deaths in detail that no company record could provide. Stories about families left behind, dreams that were never fulfilled, and the fear they felt during those final moments when they realized they would never leave Station 5 alive. But the notes also contained warnings. Other technicians had been sent to work alone at Station 5 over the years, and not all of them had survived the experience. Some had been found dead from equipment accidents that seemed impossible given their training and experience. Others had simply vanished during winter storms. Their bodies never recovered despite extensive search efforts. According to the Phantom workers, these weren't accidents. They were failures to understand what was required to survive at Station 5 during the polar night. The facility demanded acknowledgement of its history, respect for the men who had died keeping the oil flowing, and a willingness to become part of the memorial if necessary. I was being tested by the dead, and my survival depended on passing their evaluation. The test came during my 7th week, when a massive storm system moved through the area and knocked out all external communications. The satellite uplink went down, the emergency radio failed, and even the automated reporting systems that sent data to Anchorage stopped functioning. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with 47 ghosts who had been waiting for this opportunity. The Phantom workers became visible that night. Not shadows or peripheral glimpses, but fully manifested figures walking through the facility like they were reporting for duty. I watched them through security monitors as they performed maintenance tasks throughout the station, working with tools that appeared and disappeared as needed. They were dressed in safety gear from different decades, their faces showing the effects of industrial accidents that had claimed their lives. Some bore burn scars from explosions, others showed signs of crushing injuries or exposure damage. But they all worked with the same dedication that had killed them, maintaining systems that kept the oil flowing and the facility operational. I understood then what they wanted from me, not just acknowledgement of their sacrifice, but a promise to tell their stories to the outside world. To make sure their names weren't forgotten in company databases and memorial plaques that nobody ever read. I spent the rest of the night writing down everything they showed me. Names, dates, personal histories, and detailed accounts of how each man had died in service to Station 5. The Phantom workers guided me to locations where personal belongings had been hidden, showed me maintenance logs that proved their continued presence, and shared memories of the work they had loved enough to die for. By morning, I had filled 3 notebooks with their stories. 47 individual accounts of men who had chosen to work in one of the most dangerous places on Earth because someone had to keep the pipeline operational. Men who had died alone and forgotten, leaving families who never learned the true circumstances of their loss. The storm cleared the next day, and communication systems came back online. Within hours, a rescue helicopter was dispatched to evacuate me from Station 5, ending my assignment 3 weeks early. The official reason was medical concerns about extended isolation, but I suspected the real reason was the reports I had been filing about equipment malfunctions and security system failures. The company didn't want to acknowledge that Station 5 was haunted, because that would raise questions about worker safety and the psychological effects of extreme isolation. It was easier to rotate personnel frequently and classify the unusual incidents as equipment problems or stress-related hallucinations. But I kept my promise to the Phantom workers. I compiled their stories into a comprehensive report that I submitted to company management, union representatives, and workplace safety organizations. The report documented 47 deaths that had occurred at Station 5, including circumstances that had never been properly investigated or explained. The response was exactly what I expected. The company dismissed my report as the product of isolation-induced stress and psychological breakdown. Union representatives expressed concern but took no action beyond requesting better psychological screening for remote assignments. Safety organizations filed my report with thousands of others and forgot about it within weeks. But the families of the dead workers responded differently. Wives who had spent decades wondering what really happened to their husbands. Children who had grown up without fathers and never received satisfactory explanations about their deaths. Brothers and sisters who had always suspected that official accident reports were incomplete or inaccurate. For the first time in decades, the men who died at Station 5 were remembered as individuals rather than statistics. Memorial services were held, stories were shared, and families finally received the closure they had been denied by corporate bureaucracy and government indifference. I never returned to pipeline work after my experience at Station 5. The isolation and darkness had left me with psychological scars that made it impossible to work alone in remote locations. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my house in Anchorage, I can hear the sound of machinery running in the distance. The phantom workers are still at Station 5, maintaining equipment and preventing failures that could kill the living technicians who follow in my footsteps. They will continue their duties until the pipeline shuts down permanently or until their sacrifice is properly acknowledged by the company that sent them to die in the Arctic darkness. I wrote this account because the dead deserve to be remembered by name, not forgotten as employee numbers and safety statistics. Station 5 is haunted by 47 men who loved their work enough to die for it, and who continue that work even in death because someone has to keep the oil flowing south to the lower 48 states. Their names are carved into my memory as deeply as the Arctic cold carved into their bodies during those final moments when they realized they would never go home again. And every winter, when the polar night returns to northern Alaska, they resume their eternal shift at the facility that became their tomb and their monument. Story 6. Room 717. I stood at the window ledge of room 717 in the historic Anchorage Hotel for 47 minutes last Tuesday, fighting the overwhelming urge to jump. What I discovered about the 5 guests who died there in 1982 made me understand that some hotel rooms collect more than just dust and memories. My name is Robert Hayes, and I work as a safety inspector for the state of Alaska. My job involves evaluating building codes, fire safety systems, and structural integrity for commercial properties throughout the state. It is boring work most of the time, but it pays well and keeps me traveling to places I would never visit otherwise. The assignment at the historic Anchorage Hotel came through normal channels. The building was undergoing renovations to upgrade its fire suppression systems, and the state required a comprehensive safety inspection before issuing new occupancy permits. The hotel had been operating since 1916, and its historical status meant that any modifications had to be carefully documented and approved. I checked into room 717 on a Monday evening in March, planning to spend a week conducting my inspection from the inside out. The hotel manager, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed nervous when she handed me the key card. She mentioned that the room had been recently renovated and that I was the first guest to stay there since the work was completed. What she didn't mention was why the room had needed renovation in the first place. The first thing I noticed about room 717 was the window. It was larger than the windows in other rooms I had seen, extending almost from floor to ceiling with a view that looked directly down at the street 7 stories below. The glass had been recently replaced, and the frame showed signs of fresh installation work. But there was something wrong with the perspective from that window. Looking down at the street created a sense of vertigo that was more intense than the height alone should have produced. The angle seemed wrong somehow, like the window was positioned to emphasize the drop rather than provide a normal view of the city. I unpacked my equipment and spent the evening reviewing building plans and historical records. The hotel had a relatively clean safety history, with only minor violations over the decades. But as I dug deeper into the archives, I found references to an incident in 1982 that had been heavily redacted from most official documents. On October 13th of that year, 5 guests staying in different rooms throughout the hotel had committed suicide by jumping from the window of room 717. All 5 deaths occurred within a 2-hour period during the night, and none of the victims had left suicide notes or shown previous signs of mental distress. The incident had been classified as a mass suicide pact, though investigators never determined how the 5 guests had communicated or coordinated their actions. They came from different cities, had no known connections to each other, and had checked into the hotel on different dates for various business and personal reasons. But all 5 had ended their lives by climbing out the same window and falling 7 stories to the concrete sidewalk below. I tried to find more details about the 1982 incident, but most records had been sealed by court order following lawsuits from the victims' families. What information remained suggested that the investigation had uncovered evidence that challenged conventional understanding of suicide behavior in group psychology. The hotel had closed room 717 permanently after the incident, converting it to storage space rather than risk additional deaths. But recent renovations had returned it to guest use, with new safety features that were supposed to prevent similar tragedies. I learned all of this during my first night in the room, while fighting an increasingly powerful compulsion to approach the window and look down at the street below. The urge started as simple curiosity. The view from 7 stories up was impressive, showing the lights of downtown Anchorage spreading out toward Cook Inlet and the Chugach Mountains beyond. But as I stood at the window, my attention kept returning to the street directly below, to the exact spot where 5 people had ended their lives 40 years earlier. Looking down created a strange sensation that I had never experienced before. The distance seemed both impossibly far and easily bridged, like I could simply step across the gap between the window and the pavement. My rational mind understood that a 7-story fall would be fatal, but some deeper part of my brain insisted that the drop was survivable, even desirable. I forced myself away from the window and tried to focus on my inspection work, but the compulsion returned stronger each time I glanced in that direction. By midnight, I was actively avoiding that side of the room, keeping my back turned to the window and my attention focused on paperwork that didn't require me to look up. But ignoring the window didn't make the urge disappear. It grew stronger throughout the night, accompanied by a strange certainty that something was waiting for me outside. Not on the street below, but in the space between the window and the ground, suspended in the darkness like an invitation to join whatever was out there. I didn't sleep well that first night. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself imagining what it would feel like to climb onto the window ledge, to feel the cool night air against my face and the emptiness stretching out below my feet. The thoughts weren't too morbid or frightening. They were peaceful, almost euphoric, like contemplating a long-awaited vacation. But I had work to do, and years of professional experience had taught me to compartmentalize personal discomfort when necessary. I spent Tuesday morning inspecting the hotel's fire safety systems, documenting sprinkler coverage and emergency exit routes throughout the building. That is when I discovered that room 717 wasn't the only space in the hotel with a troubling history. The hotel's incident logs, which I was required to review as part of my safety inspection, showed a pattern of unusual events that stretched back decades. Guests reporting nightmares about falling, sleepwalking episodes that ended at windows or balconies, and emergency calls from rooms where visitors claimed they were being compelled to hurt themselves. Most disturbing were the near-miss incidents. Guests found standing on window ledges with no memory of how they got there. Security footage showing people walking toward dangerous areas of the building while apparently sleepwalking. And multiple reports of visitors who checked out early, claiming they felt unsafe in their rooms but unable to explain why. The pattern was strongest on the 7th floor, particularly in rooms near 717. But similar incidents had been reported throughout the building, suggesting that whatever had caused the 1982 suicides was still active and still influencing hotel guests. I requested to interview Mrs. Patterson about the building's history, but she was reluctant to discuss details that might affect the hotel's reputation. Instead, she provided me with contact information for Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychiatrist who had been involved in the original investigation of the 1982 incident. Dr. Morrison, now in her 80s and long retired, was willing to meet with me that evening. What she told me about the suicides changed my understanding of what I was dealing with in room 717. According to Dr. Morrison, the 5 victims in 1982 had not been suffering from conventional mental illness or suicidal ideation. Psychological evaluations conducted after their deaths, based on interviews with family members and analysis of their personal belongings, suggested that all 5 had been mentally healthy individuals with no history of depression or self-harm. But their behavior during the final weeks before their deaths had shown remarkable similarities. All 5 had been experiencing vivid dreams about flying or falling. They had reported feeling drawn to high places and spending increasing amounts of time at windows or balconies. And in the days immediately before the suicides, all 5 had expressed a growing certainty that they were meant to be somewhere else, somewhere they could only reach by leaving their current location in a dramatic way. Dr. Morrison's theory was that the victims had been influenced by what she called environmental psychology. Something about room 717 specifically, and the 7th floor generally, created psychological conditions that made guests susceptible to self-destructive impulses. She had recommended that the hotel permanently close the affected areas and conduct extensive environmental testing to identify potential causes. Chemical contamination, electromagnetic fields, infrasound, or other environmental factors that could influence brain chemistry and decision-making processes. But her recommendations had been ignored. The hotel had implemented cosmetic changes, moved room 717 out of service for a few years, and waited for public attention to move on to other tragedies. Now room 717 was back in operation, and I was experiencing firsthand the same compulsions that had driven 5 people to their deaths. Dr. Morrison warned me not to spend another night in the room. She had seen the effects of prolonged exposure to whatever was influencing guests, and she believed that my safety inspector training wouldn't protect me from psychological forces I didn't understand. But I had a job to complete, and my professional reputation depended on delivering thorough inspection reports regardless of personal discomfort. I returned to room 717 Tuesday evening, determined to finish my work and check out the next morning. That decision nearly cost me my life. The compulsion to approach the window was overwhelming from the moment I entered the room. Not a gradual build-up like the previous night, but an immediate, powerful urge that felt like a physical force pulling me toward the glass. I found myself standing at the window before I realized I had moved, staring down at the street with growing certainty that I belonged down there rather than up here. The sensation was euphoric. Standing at the window felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something I had been searching for my entire life. The street below seemed welcoming, almost luminous, like it was calling to me personally. I understood then why the 5 guests in 1982 had jumped. Not because they were suicidal, but because jumping felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like stepping through a doorway into a better place. But some part of my rational mind remained functional, and I forced myself to step back from the window. The effort required was enormous, like fighting against a powerful magnetic field that wanted to draw me forward. My hands were shaking and my heart was racing, but I managed to put distance between myself and the glass. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone in the room. 5 figures stood near the window, translucent but clearly visible in the dim light from the street below. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, their faces peaceful and expectant as they watched me struggle against the same compulsion that had claimed their lives. The ghosts of the 1982 suicides weren't trying to frighten me. They were trying to welcome me, to show me that the jump was nothing to fear. They gestured toward the window with expressions of infinite patience, like teachers waiting for a slow student to understand a simple lesson. I realized that the 5 victims hadn't died alone. They had been guided by previous suicides, people who had jumped from room 717 during earlier decades when such deaths had been easier to cover up or classify as accidents. The hotel had been collecting suicides for nearly a century, and each death made the next one more likely. The building itself had become a kind of trap, using the accumulated psychic energy of self-destruction to influence new victims. Room 717 was the focal point, but the entire 7th floor was contaminated by decades of tragedy. Fighting against the compulsion required every technique I had learned for dealing with workplace hazards. I treated the suicidal urge like exposure to toxic gas, something that could kill me if I didn't take immediate protective action. I called the front desk and requested an immediate room change, claiming a plumbing emergency that made 717 uninhabitable. Mrs. Patterson was reluctant to accommodate the request, but I insisted with enough authority to get transferred to a room on the 3rd floor. Moving my belongings took incredible effort, as every step away from room 717 felt like walking uphill against hurricane-force winds. But once I was established in the new room, the compulsion faded to manageable levels. I could think clearly again, make rational decisions about my safety and professional responsibilities. I completed my inspection work the next morning and submitted a report that classified room 717 as structurally unsafe due to window design that created unacceptable psychological hazards. I recommended permanent closure of the room and psychological evaluation for all guests who had stayed there during the recent renovation period. The hotel management rejected my recommendations, claiming that my report exceeded the scope of structural safety inspection and ventured into areas outside my professional expertise. They threatened legal action if I shared my findings with other agencies or the general public. But I kept copies of all my documentation, including photographs of the ghostly figures I had seen near the window. The images were unclear, but they showed enough detail to support my theory about the room, supernatural influences. 6 months later, I learned that another guest had jumped from the window of room 717. A businessman from Seattle, no history of mental illness, no apparent motive for suicide. He had checked into the hotel for a 2-night stay and was found on the sidewalk the next morning. The hotel management classified it as an isolated incident and implemented additional safety measures, including sensors that would trigger alarms if the window was open. But they continued to rent the room to unsuspecting guests, continuing a cycle that had been claiming lives for decades. I tried to warn other safety inspectors and building officials about the situation at the historic Anchorage Hotel, but my reports were dismissed as stress-related hallucinations or professional burnout. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that a landmark hotel might be systematically killing its guests through supernatural influence. But I know what I experienced in room 717, and I know that the 5 ghosts are still waiting there for new victims to join their eternal vigil. The hotel continues operating, the room continues claiming lives, and the management continues covering up a pattern of deaths that stretches back nearly a century. I moved to a different job in Fairbanks, as far from the historic Anchorage Hotel as I could get while remaining in Alaska. But distance doesn't erase memory, and I still wake up sometimes with the phantom sensation of standing on that window ledge, feeling the pull of the street 7 stories below. Room 717 is still operational. The window still provides its deadly view of downtown Anchorage, and the 5 ghosts are still waiting for visitors who will complete their interrupted journey to whatever lies beyond the glass. If you ever find yourself in Anchorage and need a hotel room, avoid the historic Anchorage Hotel completely. But if circumstances force you to stay there, request a room on any floor except the 7th. And if they try to give you room 717, leave immediately and don't look back. Some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how welcoming they seem. Story 7. Cursed film reel of the 4th Avenue Theater. The film started playing by itself in the basement projection room at 3 in the morning, casting images of pure terror onto walls that hadn't seen light in decades. I was alone in the 4th Avenue Theater, conducting a routine inspection of the building, the structural damage after the 1964 earthquake, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a projector running somewhere below me. My name is Marcus Webb, and I work as a historic preservation contractor in Anchorage. The 4th Avenue Theater had been closed since the Good Friday earthquake cracked its foundation and left the building structurally unsound. The city hired me to assess whether the old movie palace could be saved or if it would have to be demolished. The theater had been Anchorage's crown jewel in the 1950s, a glamorous Art Deco cinema that brought Hollywood magic to Alaska, its largest city. But 50 years of neglect had turned it into a monument to decay, its ornate lobby filled with water damage and its velvet seats rotting in the perpetual darkness. I had spent the day documenting structural problems on the main floor when I heard mechanical sounds coming from the basement level. The building's power had been shut off for decades, but something was definitely running down there, the rhythmic clicking of film threading through a projector gate. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and utility corridors that extended beneath the entire city block. Most areas were flooded or collapsed, but I found a narrow staircase that led to what had once been the theater's private screening room. The door stood open, and light was flickering from inside. The projection booth contained equipment I had never seen before, not the standard 35mm systems used in commercial theaters, but something older and more complex. Multiple film reels were mounted on a machine that looked like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a cinema. And threading through the maze of gears and lenses was a single strip of film that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The images being projected onto the basement wall defied everything I knew about 1950s filmmaking technology. The footage was shot in a handheld style that wouldn't be invented for another 20 years, following a cameraman as he ran through an Alaskan forest in obvious panic. The film quality was impossibly crisp for its age, with colors that seemed more vivid than reality. But what made my skin crawl was the timestamp in the corner. The date showed March 27, 1964, the exact day of the Good Friday earthquake. The cameraman was breathing heavily as he stumbled through dense spruce trees, his equipment jostling with each panic step. Through the viewfinder, I could see glimpses of something pursuing him. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Flashes of movement that suggested creatures too large and too fast to be native wildlife. But the most disturbing aspect was the sound. Even though the film reel was obviously decades old, I could hear the cameraman, his voice as clearly as if he were standing next to me. He was muttering coordinates, GPS readings that corresponded to locations in the Chugach National Forest. And between the coordinates, he kept repeating the same phrase. They were not supposed to exist here. The earthquake opened something that should have stayed closed. The film ran for exactly 17 minutes before cutting to static. But in those 17 minutes, I witnessed footage that challenged everything I understood about Alaska, its natural history and the events of March 27, 1964. According to the images, the Good Friday earthquake hadn't just damaged buildings and infrastructure. It had cracked something deep beneath Alaska, this wilderness, releasing entities that had been trapped in subterranean chambers since before human habitation. The cameraman had been documenting these creatures when something went terribly wrong. As the static filled the basement screening room, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The film reel was still turning, but new images were appearing on the wall. Fresh footage, shot in real time, showing the basement where I was standing. I was watching myself on the projection screen, filmed from angles that should have been impossible given the position of the projector. The camera seemed to be floating freely around the room, capturing my growing terror from perspectives that defied the laws of physics. That was when I realized I wasn't alone in the basement. The entities from the forest footage were here, in the theater, watching me through eyes that existed partially in our dimension and partially somewhere else. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing against my consciousness, intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien examining me with the same clinical interest the original cameraman had brought to documenting their existence. The film reel contained more than just footage. It was a recording device that captured not just images and sound, but the essence of anyone who encountered it. Every person who had watched the cursed film over the past 60 years had been absorbed into its narrative, becoming part of a growing collection of human consciousness preserved on celluloid. I tried to leave the basement, but the corridors had changed. Passages that had been clear when I entered were now blocked by walls that looked like they had been there for decades. The building itself was rearranging its architecture, trapping me in a space that operated according to rules established by the entities from the earthquake footage. The projector continued running, showing new scenes that revealed the true history of the 4th Avenue Theater. The building hadn't been closed because of earthquake damage. It had been sealed because of what the 1964 tremors had awakened beneath it. The theater sat directly above a network of natural caverns that had been cracked open by the seismic activity, allowing creatures from Earth's deep places to establish a foothold in downtown Anchorage. For 60 years, these entities had been using the theater as a monitoring station, observing human behavior and collecting specimens for study. The film reel was their primary tool for preservation, capable of recording not just physical appearance but memory, personality, and consciousness itself. Every person who had disappeared in Anchorage since 1964 was here, stored in the endless footage that continued threading through the impossible projection system. Construction workers, city inspectors, urban explorers, and curious teenagers, all preserved in a medium that existed partially outside normal spacetime. But the entities weren't just collecting humans randomly. They were building a database, cataloging human behavior patterns and psychological responses to prepare for something larger. The footage showed glimpses of similar operations in other cities, other theaters, and abandoned buildings that served as research stations for intelligences that viewed humanity as an interesting but ultimately expendable species. The Good Friday earthquake hadn't been a natural disaster. It had been a coordinated event, triggered by entities that needed to establish surface access points after millennia of living in Earth's deep places. Climate change and human activity were affecting their subterranean habitats, forcing them to consider relocating to environments closer to the surface. But first, they needed to understand the intelligence that was causing these environmental changes. As I sat trapped in the basement screening room, watching endless footage of human specimens being processed and cataloged, I began to understand my role in their research. I wasn't just another random victim. I was a representative of the humans who worked to preserve historical structures, someone who understood the value of maintaining records and documentation. The entities wanted me to become their archivist, helping to organize and interpret the human behavioral data they had been collecting since 1964. My knowledge of construction, engineering, and preservation techniques would be valuable in their ongoing effort to establish permanent surface facilities. The film reel offered me a choice, communicating through images that bypassed normal language centers in my brain. I could resist and join the other preserved specimens, my consciousness trapped in endless loops of recorded experience. Or I could cooperate, becoming a willing participant in research that would ultimately determine humanity's fate when the entities emerged from their hiding places. But there was something the entities didn't understand about human nature: our capacity for sabotage. Instead of choosing cooperation or resistance, I chose destruction. The basement projection room was filled with 60 years' worth of film stock, reels containing the preserved consciousness of thousands of missing persons. If I could damage the storage system, I might be able to free the trapped souls and disrupt the entity's research project. I grabbed a crowbar from my toolkit and began systematically destroying the projection equipment. Each reel I shattered released flashes of human memory and personality back into the physical world, fragments of consciousness that had been trapped in celluloid for decades. The entities responded with fury that manifested as physical force, pressing against my mind with pressure that threatened to crush my sanity. But the destruction was already underway, and the basement filled with the voices of thousands of people who had been missing from Anchorage since 1964. As the last film reel cracked apart in my hands, the basement began to collapse. Not from structural damage, but from the removal of whatever force had been holding the space together outside normal physics. The entity's research station was failing, and they were being forced back into the deep places beneath the city. But their retreat wasn't permanent. I escaped from the collapsing theater just as emergency services arrived to investigate reports of underground explosions. The official investigation blamed the collapse on delayed earthquake damage and gas leaks. But I knew the truth. The entities from the deep places were still down there, already working to establish new research stations in other abandoned buildings around Anchorage. The film reel I destroyed was just one of many collection points scattered throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Every major earthquake since 1964 had opened new access points, allowing the entities to expand their surface operations and continue gathering human specimens for their ongoing research project. I tried to warn city officials about what I had discovered, but my reports were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations caused by exposure to asbestos and structural collapse. The 4th Avenue Theater was demolished 6 months later, and the site was paved over to become a parking lot. But sometimes, late at night, residents of downtown Anchorage report seeing lights in the basement levels of other old buildings. Projection lights casting images onto walls that shouldn't exist, showing footage of people who went missing decades ago. The entities are still collecting specimens, still building their database of human behavior. And when they finally emerge from the deep places to reclaim a planet that has always belonged to them, they know exactly how to manage the species that thought it owned the world. The 4th Avenue Theater is gone, but the film reel continues playing somewhere beneath Anchorage. New footage is being shot every day, documenting the final phase of research before first contact begins. I'm still here, still trying to warn anyone who will listen about what lurks beneath Alaska's cities. But I know my time is running out. The entities remember what I did to their collection, and they want me back. Every night, I dream of walking through that basement projection room again, watching footage of myself destroying their precious archives. But in the dreams, I always make the other choice: cooperation instead of sabotage. When I wake up, there's always a strip of film on my nightstand. Fresh footage showing scenes I don't remember experiencing, shot from angles that suggest the camera was floating just behind my shoulder. The entities are patient, but they forgive, and they never stop recording. Story 8. Mind-bending fog of Glacier Bay. The fog swallowed my kayak so completely that I lost all sense of direction within seconds. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the absolute silence. No wind, no water lapping against my hull, no sound at all except my own breathing, which seemed to echo back from impossible directions. I had been paddling solo through Glacier Bay for 3 days, documenting ice formations for a climate research project based out of Juneau. The work was routine. Photograph glacial retreat patterns, collect GPS coordinates, and file reports about changing conditions in one of Alaska's most pristine wilderness areas. Nothing in my 15 years as an environmental photographer had prepared me for what lurked in that unnatural fog bank. The morning started normally enough. Clear skies, calm water, and perfect visibility across the bay, this dramatic landscape of ice and granite. I was heading toward the Marjorie Glacier when I noticed a wall of fog rolling in from the northwest, moving against the prevailing wind patterns. Fog in Glacier Bay isn't unusual, but this formation defied every meteorological principle I understood. It rose from the water like a solid wall, perfectly vertical, with edges so sharp they looked drawn with a ruler. The mass moved with purpose rather than drifting naturally, and as it approached, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. I should have turned back toward shore immediately. Should have trusted the primitive warning signals firing in my brain. But scientific curiosity overrode survival instinct, and I paddled directly into the advancing fog bank to document what I assumed was a rare weather phenomenon. The moment I entered the fog, reality changed. Sound died completely, not muffled or dampened, but eliminated entirely, as if the fog absorbed every vibration before it could travel more than a few inches. I couldn't to hear my paddle cutting through water, couldn't to hear the drip of moisture from the blade, couldn't to even hear my own heartbeat despite the pulse pounding in my ears. Visibility dropped to zero. Not the normal gray opacity of fog, but absolute darkness that seemed to press against my eyes like a physical presence. My headlamp produced no illumination whatsoever, the beam disappearing immediately into the thick air as if the fog was consuming photons. But the most disturbing aspect was the sense of being observed. Something vast was watching me from beneath the water. I couldn't see it through the impenetrable fog, couldn't to hear it in the absolute silence, but every survival instinct I possessed screamed that I was no longer alone in the bay. Something massive was circling my kayak, studying me with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. I tried to paddle back toward clear water, but my compass spun wildly, pointing in random directions. The fog seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, creating a pocket of isolated space that operated according to different physical laws than the normal world. That was when I saw the limbs. They emerged from the water around my kayak like tentacles, but far larger and more complex than anything in marine biology. Each appendage was easily 20 feet long and covered in what looked like both scales and fur, shifting between textures as they moved. They didn't splash when they breached the surface. They simply appeared, as silent as everything else in the fog bank. The creature they belonged to remained hidden beneath the dark water, but I could sense its enormous size from the spacing of the limbs. Whatever this thing was, it dwarfed any known marine animal. A blue whale would have been insignificant next to the presence I felt moving beneath me. The limbs didn't touch my kayak, but they explored the water around me with obvious intelligence. They moved in coordinated patterns, as if the creature was trying to understand what I was without actually making contact. One appendage rose from the water near my bow, and I could see that its surface was covered with structures that looked almost like eyes, hundreds of small, dark spots that seemed to focus on me individually. I tried to photograph the limbs with my waterproof camera, but the images showed only empty water. The fog wasn't just blocking sound and light. It was somehow preventing documentation of whatever existed within its boundaries. The hallucinations began after I had been trapped in the fog for what felt like hours. I started seeing other kayakers paddling through the murky space around me. They moved with the mechanical precision of people following predetermined routes, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When I called out to them, my voice made no sound, and they showed no awareness of my presence. But I recognized their faces. They were other solo paddlers who had gone missing in Glacier Bay over the past decade. David Chen, who disappeared in 2018 while photographing icebergs. Sarah Martinez, who vanished during a research expedition in 2019. Tom Wickham, whose empty kayak was found drifting near the Lamplugh Glacier in 2020. They were all here, trapped in the fog bank, paddling endlessly through a space that existed parallel to the normal world but operated according to rules that human minds couldn't fully grasp. The creature beneath me began to surface gradually, revealing portions of its impossible anatomy. What I had taken for tentacles were actually more like arms, articulated limbs with joints and what might have been hands at their extremities. But the hands had too many fingers, and the fingers ended in structures that looked like both claws and additional eyes. The creature's body, when I finally glimpsed it through the dark water, defied classification. It seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three I was familiar with, folding in on itself in ways that made my head pound when I tried to focus on the details. Parts of it appeared to be organic, while other sections looked more like machinery or crystalline formations. But the most disturbing aspect was its obvious intelligence. The creature was studying me with the same scientific curiosity I had brought to documenting glacial retreat. I was a specimen to be observed, catalogued, and potentially preserved for further examination. The fog bank wasn't a weather phenomenon. It was a laboratory, a controlled environment where something unimaginably old conducted research on the surface world, its inhabitants. I understood then why the missing kayakers were still paddling through the fog. They hadn't drowned or died from exposure. They had been preserved as ongoing subjects in an experiment that had been running for longer than human memory. The creature began communicating with me, not through sound but through direct neural contact that bypassed normal sensory channels. Images flooded my consciousness. Visions of Glacier Bay as it had existed thousands of years before human arrival, when the ice sheets extended much further and the marine ecosystem operated according to different principles. The entity had been here since before the glaciers formed, adapting its existence to the changing environment over geological timescales. It had watched the ice advance and retreat multiple times, had observed the evolution and extinction of countless species, and had developed technologies that allowed it to manipulate local space-time in ways that created pockets of isolated reality. The fog bank was one such pocket, a research station where the creature could study surface dwellers without interference from the outside world. Time moved differently here, allowing for extended observation periods that would appear as brief disappearances to external observers. But the creature's research had a purpose beyond simple scientific curiosity. Climate change was affecting its deep water habitat in ways that threatened its existence. The warming ocean temperatures, changing salinity levels, and shifting current patterns were forcing it to consider relocating to different environments. But first, it needed to understand the intelligence that was causing these changes: humanity. The missing kayakers were test subjects, their behavior patterns studied to develop strategies for interacting with human civilization. The creature was preparing for first contact, but on its own terms and according to its own timeline. I was being offered a choice. I could join the other subjects, becoming a permanent resident of the fog bank where I would be preserved indefinitely for ongoing study. Or I could serve as an ambassador, returning to the surface world to prepare humanity for eventual contact with an intelligence that had inhabited Earth's oceans since before the continents reached their current positions. But there was a third option the creature didn't mention directly. As I sat in my kayak surrounded by impossible anatomy and ancient intelligence, I realized that some discoveries are too dangerous to share with the world. The creature's technologies could revolutionize human understanding of physics and biology, but they could also provide weapons that would make nuclear arsenals look primitive. Humanity wasn't ready for contact with an entity that could manipulate space-time and had been perfecting its knowledge for millions of years. I made my decision by capsizing my kayak deliberately. The icy water of Glacier Bay flooded into my dry suit as I rolled the craft upside down and held myself underwater until my lungs burned. But instead of drowning, I found myself floating in the creature's laboratory space, breathing liquid that provided oxygen more efficiently than air. The entity accepted my choice to remain as a research subject rather than risk contaminating the surface world with knowledge it couldn't handle responsibly. I joined the other kayakers in their endless paddling through fog that existed outside normal time and space. But I retained enough of my original consciousness to understand what was happening around me. The creature continued its research, preparing for eventual contact when humanity developed enough wisdom to handle the revelation that Earth's oceans contained intelligence far older and more advanced than our own. Every few years, new subjects arrive in the fog bank: solo paddlers, marine researchers, and adventurers who venture too far into Glacier Bay, its remote reaches. Most accept preservation as research subjects. A few choose to return to the surface world as ambassadors, spreading carefully controlled information about unusual encounters in Alaska's wilderness. The fog bank still appears in Glacier Bay, moving against prevailing winds and creating pockets of absolute silence that trap unwary kayakers. Park rangers warn visitors about sudden weather changes and the importance of staying close to shore, but they don't understand the true nature of what lurks beneath the pristine waters. The creature is patient, but climate change is accelerating its timeline for contact. The research phase is nearing completion, and soon it will emerge from the deep waters to announce its presence to a world that thinks it owns the planet. When that day comes, humanity will discover that they've been sharing Earth with intelligence that predates our species by millions of years. And the entity will judge whether they evolved enough wisdom to deserve continued existence on a world that has always belonged to others. The fog bank in Glacier Bay is just the beginning. Similar research stations exist in deep waters around the globe, all preparing for the same eventual revelation. I am still here, paddling through impossible space, helping to study the species that might not survive its own success. The creature treats its subjects well, preserving us in conditions that feel more real than the surface world we left behind. But sometimes, in the absolute silence of the fog bank, I wonder if we made the right choice by keeping humanity ignorant of what waits in the deep waters. The creature, this research will conclude eventually. And when it does, every human on Earth will learn whether our species passed the test for continued survival on a planet that has never truly been ours. Story 9. Magnetic anomaly of the Yukon River. My compass needle spun like a broken record player the moment I crossed that invisible line on the Yukon River. That should have been my warning to turn around. Instead, I kept rowing deeper into what locals call the Dead Mile. 3 days earlier, I was just another weekend warrior from Anchorage looking to escape my divorce papers and a job I hated. The plan was simple: rent a John boat, float down the Yukon for a week, maybe catch some salmon and clear my head. What I found instead was a stretch of river that exists outside the normal rules of physics. The first sign something was wrong came from my GPS. The screen flickered, then displayed coordinates that placed me somewhere in the middle of the Sahara Desert. I laughed it off initially. Electronics fail in Alaska all the time. But then my watch stopped. Not died, stopped. The second hand froze between 11 and 12 like time itself had hit a wall. That low humming started around noon on the second day. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that felt more like a vibration in my bones than something I actually heard. The frequency made my teeth ache and set every nerve on edge. I've worked construction for 20 years. I know what machinery sounds like. This wasn't machinery. The water here was different too. Instead of the muddy brown typical of the Yukon, it ran dark green, almost black in places. Perfectly still despite the current that should have been carrying me downstream. My oars barely disturbed the surface, creating ripples that seemed to move in slow motion before disappearing entirely. I tried calling my ex-wife that evening, partly to check if my phone worked, mostly because the silence was driving me crazy. The call connected, but Sarah's voice came through stretched and distorted, like an old cassette tape playing at half speed. When I asked if she could hear me clearly, there was a long pause before she answered. Too long. When she finally spoke, she said I'd been gone for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I'd been on the river for 2 days. The humming grew stronger that night. It pulled me from my tent around 3 in the morning, though my frozen watch still read 11:59. Above, the aurora borealis painted the sky in violent greens and purples, but the lights moved wrong. Instead of their usual graceful dance, they jerked and stuttered like a damaged film reel. That's when I saw the other boats. Dozens of them, maybe more, scattered across the water in perfect formation. John boats, canoes, even what looked like an old steamboat from the gold rush era. All empty, all floating motionless in that impossible current. I counted 17 vessels before my flashlight died. Not the batteries. The bulb itself had somehow burned out, leaving behind a smell like ozone and copper pennies. In the darkness that followed, I could hear voices drifting across the water. Conversations in languages I didn't recognize. Laughter that sounded decades old, and underneath it all, that relentless mechanical humming. By morning, the other boats were gone. Only gouges in the muddy bank remained where they might have been dragged ashore. Or dragged under. I tried to leave then, really tried. But every time I paddled toward what should have been downstream, I found myself back at the same bend in the river. The same fallen log, the same eagle's nest in the same dead tree. A perfect loop with no exit. The humming changed on the third day. What had been a steady drone became rhythmic, almost like Morse code. 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS, something was calling for help. And it had been calling for a very long time. That is when I understood what this place really was. Not just a magnetic anomaly, but a trap. A piece of the Yukon River that had somehow become unstuck from time and space, collecting travelers like a spider. This web collects flies. The other boats hadn't left. They were still here, just existing in different moments, different layers of the same horrible now. I am writing this on the 4th day, though my watch still shows 11:59 and the sun hasn't moved from its position directly overhead. The humming has gotten louder, more insistent. Sometimes I catch glimpses of the other travelers out of the corner of my eye. A gold prospector with a gray beard, a native woman in traditional dress, what looks like a pilot in a World War II bomber jacket. They were all trying to warn me about something, but their words come out as that same mechanical humming, Their mouths move in perfect synchronization with the sound that has been drilling into my skull for days. My phone battery should have died by now, but it reads 100% charge. The divorce papers in my tackle box have aged 20 years. The ink faded to brown, the paper brittle as autumn leaves. Yet I feel exactly the same as when I first crossed that invisible line. No hunger, no thirst, no fatigue. Just the growing certainty that I am becoming part of whatever keeps this place running. The compass needle has stopped spinning. It points steadily toward the deepest part of the dead mile, where the water runs so dark it might as well be a hole in the world. Sometimes shapes move beneath the surface down there. Big shapes, patient shapes. I think I know now why the humming sounds like an SOS. It's not a call for help. It's a lure. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The universal distress signal that every pilot, every sailor, every person with a radio license recognizes instinctively. How many boats have answered that call over the decades? How many people have tried to help, only to find themselves trapped in this bubble of broken time? The sun is finally starting to move. After 4 days of high noon, it is beginning to set. But it is setting in the wrong direction, sinking slowly into the eastern sky like everything else here has been turned backward. As darkness falls, I can see lights beneath the water, not reflections from the aurora above, but lights moving with purpose in the depths. They reforming patterns, spelling out words in a language that predates any human tongue. The humming is getting closer now. It is not coming from the water anymore. It is coming from me. I understand now why my ex-wife said I'd been gone 2 weeks when I'd only been here 2 days. Time moves differently for people on the outside looking in. What feels like days here might be years out there. Decades. Centuries. My hands are starting to glow with the same phosphorescent light as the shapes in the water. When I speak, the sound comes out as that mechanical humming. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. I am becoming part of the lure now. Another voice calling to travelers on the Yukon River. Another light in the darkness beckoning them toward the dead mile. If you, rereading this somehow, if my phone managed to send this message before it became something else entirely, stay away from the stretch of river 20 miles north of Ruby. Don, to trust your instruments when they start acting strange. Don, to follow the lights in the water. And whatever you do, Don, to answer the SOS. Story 10. Week of doubles. I saw my dead father standing in the parking lot of the Talkeetna Roadhouse on October 14, 2003, exactly 3 years after I buried him. He looked at me with empty eyes for 30 seconds, then walked into the forest and vanished. By the end of that week, everyone in town had seen someone who shouldn't to exist. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I moved to Talkeetna in 2001 to escape the memories of my father, his death and my own failures as a son. The small town sits at the confluence of 3 rivers in the shadow of Denali, population maybe 800 people who mostly mind their own business. It seemed like the perfect place to disappear and start over. I worked as a mechanic at Peterson, as auto repair, fixing trucks and snowmobiles for locals and the occasional tourist heading up to climb the mountain. The work was simple and honest, requiring nothing more than technical skill and the ability to show up sober every morning. After years of corporate stress and family drama in the lower 48, Talkeetna felt like salvation. But salvation turned into a nightmare during the second week of October 2003, when the town became infected by something that shouldn't have been possible. It started with Betty Morrison seeing her husband Frank at the grocery store on Monday morning. Nothing unusual about that, except Frank had died of a heart attack 6 months earlier. Betty was still in mourning, still adjusting to life as a widow, so her family assumed she was having some kind of grief-related hallucination. But Frank looked exactly like he had in life. Same clothes, same mannerisms, same slight limp from an old logging accident. He was standing in the cereal aisle, staring at boxes of cornflakes with the blank expression of someone who had forgotten why he was there. When Betty called his name, he turned and looked at her with eyes that showed no recognition, no emotion, no spark of the man she had married 37 years earlier. Then he walked out of the store and disappeared into the maze of streets and cabins that made up residential Talkeetna. Word spread through town the way news always does in small communities. By Tuesday evening, everyone knew that Betty Morrison claimed to have seen her dead husband buying groceries. Most people were sympathetic but skeptical, chalking it up to the kind of psychological stress that comes with sudden loss. But Tuesday brought more sightings. Jim Patterson saw his brother Mike, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, standing outside the post office. Sarah Chen glimpsed her mother through the window of the library, though her mother had passed away the previous winter. Tom Wheeler swore he saw his childhood friend Bobby Thompson walking down Main Street, despite attending Bobby's funeral after a fishing accident in 1998. Each witness described the same thing: perfect physical duplicates of dead people, acting with mechanical precision but showing no signs of consciousness or recognition. They would appear in public places, perform simple actions like walking or standing, then disappear when approached or questioned. By Wednesday, the sightings weren't limited to dead people anymore. That's when I saw my father for the first time. I was leaving Peterson's garage after a long day working on a broken snowplow when I spotted him across the street. He was wearing the same green flannel shirt and work boots he had been buried in, standing motionless next to the roadhouse like he was waiting for someone. My breath caught in my throat, and my hands started shaking so badly I dropped my keys on the gravel. Dad had died of pancreatic cancer in Seattle, wasting away over 6 months while I watched helplessly from his bedside. I had seen his body in the casket, had thrown dirt on his grave, had spent 3 years trying to process the guilt of all the things I never said to him while he was alive. But there he was, looking exactly as he had before the cancer hollowed him out. Healthy, solid, real in every detail except for his eyes. Those familiar brown eyes that had watched me grow up, that had shown pride when I graduated high school and disappointment when I dropped out of college, were now completely empty. Like windows in an abandoned house. I called his name, and he turned toward me with the slow, mechanical movement of someone following a programmed response. For 30 seconds, we stared at each other across the empty street. Then he turned away and walked into the forest behind the roadhouse, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. I followed him as far as the tree line, but he had vanished completely. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had passed through the dense undergrowth. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist the moment he entered the woods. That night, I called my sister in Seattle to ask if she had been having dreams about Dad. She told me she had seen him twice that week, standing in her backyard and walking through the grocery store where she worked. She assumed it was her mind playing tricks, but the details were too specific and too consistent to be simple grief hallucinations. Dad was appearing to both of us, 2,000 miles apart, at the same time. Thursday brought reports of living people being duplicated. Mary Sullivan saw herself standing in her own front yard, staring at the house with blank expression. The duplicate was wearing different clothes and had slightly different posture, but the face was identical down to the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. Dave Martinez encountered his own double while walking his dog near the railroad tracks. The duplicate was walking in the opposite direction with the same dog, like a mirror image of Dave's evening routine. When the two versions of Dave got close enough to touch, both dogs started barking frantically and pulling their owners in different directions. By Thursday evening, everyone in Talkeetna had either seen a duplicate of someone they knew or had been told by a reliable witness that their own duplicate had been spotted around town. The phenomenon was no longer isolated incidents that could be explained by grief or stress. It was a town-wide event that defied every rational explanation. But the strangest part was how the duplicates behaved. They weren't trying to replace or impersonate the original people. They weren't communicating or interacting in meaningful ways. They simply existed, performing basic actions like walking, standing, or looking around with the mechanical precision of very sophisticated robots. It was as if something was practicing being human, learning the basic movements and expressions but not understanding the consciousness behind them. Friday brought the revelation that changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. I was closing up the garage when I saw a group of duplicates gathered in the town square. Maybe 20 of them, representing various people from Talkeetna, this past and present. Dead relatives, living neighbors, and even tourists who had passed through town months or years earlier. They were standing in a rough circle, perfectly still, like actors waiting for their cue to begin a performance. But what made my skin crawl was their coordinated behavior. Every 30 seconds, all 20 duplicates would turn their heads in the same direction, scanning the area with identical movements. They were clearly connected somehow, sharing information or receiving instructions from a source I couldn't identify. I watched from the shadows as more duplicates emerged from various buildings around the square. They took positions in the circle with military precision, expanding the group to maybe 40 individuals. Dead and living, old and young, all unified by the same empty expression and mechanical movements. That It's when I realized what was happening. The duplicates weren't random appearances or grief-induced hallucinations. They were reconnaissance. Something was studying the people of Talkeetna, creating perfect physical copies to understand human behavior and social structures. But reconnaissance for what purpose? The answer came Saturday morning, when I woke up to find my own duplicate standing at the foot of my bed. The thing that looked like me was wearing my clothes, had my face, even had the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident with a broken bottle. But its eyes were wrong, showing the same emptiness I had seen in all the other duplicates. It was studying me with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a laboratory specimen. We stared at each other for maybe 5 minutes, neither of us moving or speaking. I was paralyzed by a combination of terror and fascination, unable to look away from this perfect copy of myself that somehow existed without being alive in any meaningful sense. Finally, the duplicate turned and walked out of my cabin through the front door, which I was certain I had locked before going to sleep. I followed it outside and watched as it joined a larger group of duplicates gathering in the street. There were hundreds of them now, representing every person who lived in Talkeetna and many who had died or moved away. The entire population of the town, duplicated with perfect accuracy but stripped of consciousness and free will. The duplicates began moving in formation, walking toward the forest in orderly rows like soldiers reporting for duty. I followed at a safe distance, along with several other residents who had been drawn outside by the unusual activity. The procession led us to a clearing about 2 miles from town, where something waited that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. In the center of the clearing was a structure that didn't belong on Earth. It was maybe 50 feet tall and perfectly geometric, made of a material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was covered with patterns that hurt to look at directly, like optical illusions designed by an intelligence that understood vision better than humans do. The duplicates were walking into the structure and disappearing, absorbed by walls that rippled like water when touched. But they weren't being destroyed or consumed. I could see them inside the structure, moving through transparent chambers where they were being disassembled and analyzed by processes that defied description. Something was harvesting human beings, collecting detailed information about our physical forms, our behavior patterns, our social relationships. The duplicates were data storage devices, perfect copies that could be studied and understood without risking damage to the original specimens. But the most terrifying realization was that the process wasn't random. The entity responsible for the duplicates had been studying Talkeetna specifically, choosing our small isolated community as a test site for some larger project. We were laboratory animals in an experiment that none of us had consented to participate in. I tried to retreat back to town, but the forest had changed around us. Paths that should have led to familiar locations now ended at the same clearing, no matter which direction we traveled. The entity had created some kind of spatial distortion that prevented us from leaving the area. We were trapped with hundreds of our own duplicates in a structure that shouldn't exist on our planet. The few other witnesses who had followed the procession were as terrified and confused as I was. We huddled together at the edge of the clearing, watching as more duplicates emerged from the forest and joined the procession into the alien structure. But as the hours passed, I noticed that the duplicates were changing. They were becoming more lifelike, showing subtle expressions and natural movements that had been absent before. The entity was learning from its analysis, creating more sophisticated copies that could potentially pass for human under casual observation. By Sunday morning, the structure had vanished, leaving only a circle of dead grass where it had stood. The spatial distortion disappeared, allowing us to find our way back to Talkeetna. But the town felt different now, infected by the knowledge that we had been studied and cataloged by something beyond human understanding. Most of the witnesses agreed to keep quiet about what we had seen. Who would believe us anyway? And what good would it do to panic people who were trying to rebuild their lives after a week of psychological terror? But I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what had happened. If the entity could duplicate an entire town, its population in a single week, what was stopping it from expanding the process to larger communities? Cities, states, entire countries could be infiltrated by perfect copies that looked human but answered to an alien intelligence. The duplicates I had seen weren't just reconnaissance. They were prototypes for an invasion that would replace humanity so gradually that we might never realize it was happening. I left Talkeetna 2 weeks after the phenomenon ended, moving to Anchorage and then eventually to the lower 48. But distance doesn't provide safety when you dealing with an entity that can create perfect copies of anyone. anywhere. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still the original Daniel Reeves, or if I'm one of the duplicates that escaped the analysis process and retained some fragment of the original, just memories and personality. The uncertainty is maddening, but there is no way to verify my authenticity without risking contact with the entity that created the copies. I heard rumors of similar events in other isolated communities throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Brief periods when residents report seeing duplicates of familiar people, followed by official denials and media blackouts that prevent the stories from spreading. The invasion is still happening, just slowly enough that most people dawn to notice the gradual replacement of human beings with perfect copies that serve an agenda we can comprehend. But I remember the week in Tahkeetna when the masks came off, when something showed us exactly how vulnerable we are to intelligence that thinks of us as laboratory specimens rather than fellow conscious beings. And I remember my father, his empty eyes as he looked at me one last time before disappearing into the forest, carrying information about our family that will be used for purposes I prefer not to imagine. And that's the last echo for tonight. The wilderness closes back over our footprints, but the stories linger like breath in frozen air. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, so you'll know when we return to the dark. In the comments, tell us where you're listening from or share a strange story of your own. Midnight Whispers is more than a voice. It's a gathering place. Until next time, stay wary of the woods and what waits beyond the light.